And actor Alec Baldwin scoring a major victory in the Rust movie set shooting case. The Santa Fe district attorney announced that it is dropping the gun enhancement charge that carried a 5-year mandatory prison sentence if found guilty on that charge. He still faces involuntary manslaughter in the death of cinematographer Helena Hutchins after prosecutors say he shot and killed her while rehearsing with a gun. Baldwin said he didn't know that it was loaded. With that, we bring in Mark Eiglarsh, criminal defense attorney and a former prosecutor. Mark, good to have you with us. Obviously, I think everybody's eyes sort of popped when they saw this 5-year potential prison sentence in the first place. But you think this was a wise move to drop this charge. Tell us why.
Yeah, well, first of all, this is a colossal victory for Team Baldwin. You know, he was facing up to 5 years minimum mandatory if he were to lose and take on the state in this case. Now he's only facing up to 18 months, a significant penalty, but drastically different than what he was facing. But we're missing the obvious problem here. Why was he ever charged with that minimum mandatory draconian 5-year penalty when the statute that created it didn't come into effect until May of 2022, and this incident occurred October of 2021? This prosecutor should spend less time in front of the cameras and more time in front of the statute books.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. And so this is a classic case where you're saying the prosecutors were kind of out over their skis on this and they were overcharging. But I'm wondering, because now they are agreeing to get this one off the slate before they head into this legal process, does it make it more likely that the involuntary manslaughter charge makes sense to this jury when they hear all of this?
Well, they did it because clearly the defense would stand in front of them and say, okay, if you find that the offense was committed at this time, then it doesn't apply. They would have looked horrible. But I'm still not done taking jabs at them. In their response, Martha, they said, in order to avoid further litigious distractions. Distractions, that's what you're calling these? You charged them with something that should never have been charged. So now, if you're asking me to answer the question, I will. I don't think this affects their ability to get a conviction at all. It just makes them look like, okay, now we're going to follow the law and stop this miscarriage of justice by charging somebody with something that doesn't apply.
Yeah, I mean, that it does make them look like they handled this in a really ham-handed way to charge him with something that started at 5 years that wasn't even on the books when the crime was committed. That seems like something that you ought to learn in law school in one of the early stages, that you can't charge someone with a law that didn't exist at that time. I just want to replay this Alec Baldwin soundbite from December of 2021 because this is still really their defense. Watch.
It wasn't in the script for the trigger to be pulled.
Well, the trigger wasn't pulled. I didn't pull the trigger.
So you never pulled the trigger?
No. I would never point a gun at anyone and pull a trigger at them, never.
So we know that the other side is going to argue that, yes, he did pull the trigger, that the gun could not have fired unless he did release that trigger. So that's going to be a major point here, because if his side can convince them that he never pulled the trigger, then it becomes, I guess, about a malfunctioning gun that just simply was in his hand.
Yeah, as big of a mistake it was for the prosecutors to overcharge him with a statute that doesn't apply, he made equally as big a mistake as opening his mouth and saying that he didn't pull the trigger. What he needs to do is now step back and say, you know what, I may have, and in my zeal to convince the court of public opinion, I might have said something that wasn't accurate. He needs to go in there and say, I might have pulled the trigger. But it wasn't my job to check the gun. We hired people to do that. This is not at the level of criminal culpability to prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt. He cannot stick with that defense. I've seen it way too often blow up in the defendants' faces when they try to say that they didn't put enough pressure on it to pull it. That's just garbage. That's not going to work.
Mark, thank you very much. I'm still struck that we don't have more investigation into how the live rounds ended up on the set, because they weren't supposed to be anywhere near there, and we don't have a custody trace on those bullets. Like, somebody put them in that gun, and I hope we hear more about that, because I think that's an important element of this case as well. Mark, thank you. Always good to see you. Mark Eiglarsh.
Thank you, Martha.
So days after CNN's Don Lemon calls 2024 Republican presidential candidate Nikki Haley, quote, not in her prime, The View's Whoopi Goldberg today doubled down